What happens when a billionaire breaks down? Not over a failed deal, not over a market crash, but because of a waitress's act of honesty. This isn't about money or power. It's about something far more fragile and far more human. On an ordinary morning at a small-town diner, the sound of clattering dishes and sizzling oil fills the air. Among the noise, a young woman named Marissa wipes the counter with quiet focus. Her uniform is faded, her smile polite, her eyes tired but kind. She has no idea that her life is about to collide with a man whose name is known across the country, Edward Langford, a billionaire with a heart weighed down by loss. His black luxury car pulls up outside the diner, gleaming like it doesn't belong there. He steps out, polished shoes meeting cracked pavement, and walks in like a man searching for something he can't name. Their worlds couldn't be more different. Yet, fate has a strange way of tying lives together when least expected. Because somewhere between that counter and his corner booth, a small thing happens. A wallet slips from Edward's coat and lands quietly on the floor. What's inside it will soon shatter both their lives. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a story of fate, family, and a letter that changed everything. So let me ask you, would you return it if you knew it could change your life forever? The morning rush at Maplewood Diner is always the same. Clinking plates, the hiss of frying oil, and the low hum of familiar voices. The regulars sit in their usual spots, swapping the same small-town stories over endless cups of coffee. Behind the counter, Marissa moves with quiet grace. Her hands steady though her eyes reveal a weariness she's learned to hide. Every order taken, every plate served, carries the weight of responsibility. Because once her shift ends, another begins at home. Her grandmother, Evelyn, waits in their small apartment above the laundromat, her health fading faster than Marissa can manage. Between customers, Marissa sneaks glances at the clock, knowing Evelyn's pills are due soon. She sighs softly, wiping her hands on her apron, when her coworker asks if she's still planning to take that nursing course at the community college. One day, she says with a faint smile, when the Bills stop winning. The other waitress laughs gently, shaking her head. You've got the heart for it, Marissa. You just need the time. Time. That's what Marissa never seems to have enough of. Rent, medicine, repairs. Life always collects its due before dreams can take root. Yet despite it all, there's a quiet dignity in how she carries herself. She greets every customer with warmth, even when the tips are small and the exhaustion deep. By mid-morning, the diner slows. The regulars trickle out, leaving behind the scent of bacon and the echo of chatter. Marissa finally takes a breath, resting her elbows on the counter. She stares at the small notebook where she writes expenses, scratching out numbers, trying to make them fit. Just then, the bell above the door jingles. A man steps in, tall, composed, and strangely out of place. His suit is too fine for the cracked linoleum. His watch gleams in the flicker of neon light. He pauses for a moment, scanning the room, then chooses a booth in the corner. There's something about his posture, tired but controlled, as if he spent years mastering the art of appearing strong. Marissa straightens, grabs a menu, and walks over. Morning, she says with her usual warmth. Coffee to start? He looks up, his voice low and deliberate. Yes, black, please. She nods, pours his cup, and sets it down. For a brief second, their eyes meet, hers open and curious, his distant and guarded. She wonders who he is, but doesn't ask. In this diner, privacy is a kind of respect. As she turns to leave, she catches the faintest trace of sadness in his expression. It's gone in an instant, replaced by a polite nod. Marissa moves on to refill another cup, the rhythm of her day unchanged. Yet something in the air feels different now, like two worlds have quietly brushed against each other, unaware that a single act of honesty will soon bind them forever. And as she returns to the counter, the lonely man in the corner, Edward Langford, takes his first slow sip of coffee, unaware that his life is about to change. Edward Langford sat quietly in the corner booth, his posture upright, yet heavy with fatigue. The kind of man who once commanded boardrooms now stared into a chipped coffee cup as if it held answers the world had taken from him. His tailored suit spoke of wealth. His gold watch gleamed faintly beneath the diner's dull lights, but his trembling hands told another story, one of sleepless nights and ghosts that refused to rest. Marissa noticed the small details as she moved between tables. The way he fidgeted with his cufflinks, the distant look in his gray eyes. The way he flinched when laughter broke too loudly nearby. He didn't belong here, that much was obvious. But something about the quiet of this place seemed to draw him in. "Everything okay with your coffee?" she asked, offering a small, genuine smile. He looked up, almost startled. "Yes, thank you." His voice was smooth but strained, each word weighed down by something unspoken. After a pause, he added, "I used to come to places like this when I was younger. Simpler times." Marissa nodded, unsure what to say. "Yeah, simpler times don't seem to last very long." That made him smile faintly but real. "No, they don't." There was a silence between them that didn't feel awkward, just heavy with shared weariness. Finally, he spoke again. "Do you work here full-time?" "Most days," she said. "Helps with the bills. My grandmother's been sick for a while, so I pick up extra shifts when I can." Edward's eyes softened. "You're taking care of family. That's admirable." She shrugged. "It's what you do for the people you love." He nodded slowly, as if those words stirred something old and painful inside him. Then, as if to change the subject, he mentioned, "I run the Langford Foundation. We fund hospitals, education programs, things like that." Marissa's eyes widened. "That sounds incredible. You must help a lot of people." Edward looked away, his jaw tightening. "We try, but not everything can be rebuilt, not after the fire." There it was, that single word that shifted the air. The fire. He said it quietly, but it carried the weight of loss. Marissa wanted to ask what happened, but something in his expression stopped her. She sensed that behind his calm demeanor was a man holding himself together by a thread. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He gave a faint nod. "It was a long time ago. Still feels like yesterday, sometimes." Marissa didn't press. She just refilled his cup, offering a silent kind of kindness, the kind that doesn't need words. When she turned to leave, Edward's eyes followed her for a moment. There was something about her sincerity, her quiet resilience, that stirred something deep within him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. He didn't know her name yet, but for the first time in a long while, Edward Langford didn't feel entirely alone. Edward's phone buzzed sharply against the table, slicing through the quiet hum of the diner. He glanced at the screen, his face tightening as he answered. "Do you mean another fire?" His tone dropped, low, urgent, controlled but shaken. "The Langford Foundation storage wing?" Again, Marissa, who was wiping a nearby table, froze. She heard the tremor in his voice, the kind that comes when bad news sounds too familiar. "Yes, secure everything," he said into the phone, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the diner. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He rose abruptly, tossing a few bills onto the table. The movement was hurried, unlike the calm composure he'd shown earlier. His watch caught the light as he reached for his coat, revealing a trembling hand that couldn't quite steady the cuff. Marissa called after him softly, "Sir, your change." But he was already out the door, his polished shoes echoing across the tiled floor, the bell above the entrance chiming his departure. A moment later, she noticed something on the booth seat, a sleek black wallet, heavy, pristine leather, the kind that didn't belong in a place where tips came in crumpled bills. She picked it up slowly, her heart thudding with the strange weight of it. Inside were credit cards, cash too much of it, and a sealed envelope tucked into a hidden slot. The wax seal was unbroken, stamped with an elegant gold L. For a moment, temptation whispered. Just a peek, just a name. Maybe a clue about who this man really was. Maybe something that could explain why the mention of a fire had turned his voice to stone. Her thumb hovered over the seal. She felt a quiet war begin inside her, between need and conscience. The rent was due. The pharmacy bill sat unpaid on the counter at home. The old voice of survival murmured, "He's rich. He won't even notice." But then her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, words Evelyn had said 1,000 times before. Doing the right thing costs you nothing, but losing your soul costs everything. Marissa drew a long breath and set the envelope back into the wallet, her hands trembling slightly. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "Honesty it is." She walked to the window, watching as Edward's black car disappeared into the distance. A part of her wanted to chase after him, to shout, to fix this now. But he was gone. Marissa slipped the wallet into her apron pocket, a plan already forming. "Guess I'll return it myself," she murmured. The diner was quiet again, only the hum of the fridge and the faint sound of rain against the windows. Yet something about the air felt heavier, charged with a sense of change she couldn't name. She had no idea that inside that wallet, beyond the money, beyond the cards, lay a sealed truth that tied her fate to his in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Because what she didn't know was that the wallet didn't just hold his money. It held her past. The next morning, sunlight poured weakly through the curtains, painting soft lines across the kitchen table. Marissa sat opposite her grandmother, the worn leather wallet resting between them like an accusation. Evelyn stirred her tea in slow, trembling circles, her eyes fixed on the steam rather than the object before her. Marissa finally broke the silence. "He left it behind yesterday, the man at the diner. I think his name was Edward Langford." The spoon froze midst her. The clink echoed faintly, swallowed by the quiet. Evelyn's voice, frail but steady, slipped out. "Langford, you say?" Marissa nodded, sliding the wallet closer. "Yeah, I looked inside for an address. There's a photo, Grandma, of him, and a woman and a little girl. You okay?" Evelyn's hand reached forward before retreating just as quickly, as though the wallet burned to the touch. "Some things," she murmured, "are better left where they fell." Marissa frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's just a wallet, Grandma." Evelyn's gaze lifted to her granddaughter, and in her eyes there was something ancient, a recognition wrapped in sorrow. "No, it's not just a wallet. That name, Langford, I thought we'd never hear it again." Marissa's pulse quickened. "You know him?" The old woman looked away, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "I knew him. Your mother. She once worked at the Langford estate, before you were born." Marissa's brow furrowed. "Mom never mentioned that." "She wouldn't," Evelyn replied softly, "because that family, they brought nothing but ruin. The fire, the rumors, the blame that followed, it destroyed more than one life." Marissa leaned in, the air between them thick with confusion and unease. "What fire? You mean the same one he mentioned on the phone?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. Her eyes seemed lost in another decade, staring through ghosts only she could see. "That fire took his wife, but it took something from us, too. Your mother was accused of something she didn't do. That's why we left the city." Marissa blinked, the room spinning just a little. "Wait, are you saying the Langfords were connected to Mom's death?" Evelyn's lips quivered, then pressed into a thin line. "Let the past stay buried, child. Sometimes the truth brings no peace." The words settled like dust, quiet but suffocating. Marissa looked at the wallet again. The sealed envelope inside seemed to pulse with weight, as if daring her to open it. "I can't just keep it, Grandma. He's a customer. He'll come looking for it." Evelyn's voice cracked, low and desperate. "Please, Marissa, don't take it back. Promise me." Marissa hesitated. Her grandmother's fear was real, deep, raw, and trembling. But so was her own instinct, the voice that whispered right from wrong. She rose from the table, her hand resting on the wallet. "If there's something I need to know, I'll find out. Maybe it's time someone did." Evelyn's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You sound just like her, like your mother." Marissa smiled faintly, though her chest ached. "Then maybe that's not such a bad thing." As she left the house, the morning breeze brushed her face, calm, deceptive, and unaware that the choice she had just made would unravel everything she thought she knew. Would you still return it, if your family begged you not to? The bus rattled and groaned as it climbed the winding road out of the city. Marissa sat by the window, the leather wallet held tight in her lap, her reflection flickering in the glass with each passing streetlight. Outside, the scenery shifted, brick buildings and narrow streets giving way to manicured lawns, tall hedges, and gates that looked like they hadn't opened for strangers in years. Each mile felt heavier, the air growing quieter, the houses larger. She caught glimpses of old estates hidden behind iron fences, their driveways lined with trees that whispered secrets when the wind passed through. Somewhere between curiosity and dread, she wondered what kind of man lived in a place like that, a man who carried pain in his eyes and tragedy in his voice. The bus stopped near a long cobblestone drive marked Langford Estate. Marissa stepped off, the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes sounding far too loud in the still air. The mansion rose ahead, vast and solemn, its gray stone walls wrapped in ivy, its windows reflecting nothing but clouds. It looked like time had stopped here, or perhaps refused to come at all. She hesitated at the gate, clutching the wallet like a fragile truth. Then, taking a deep breath, she pressed the intercom button. A voice crackled through, crisp and distant. Yes. Hi, my name's Marissa. I work at Clark's Diner downtown. Mr. Langford left this behind yesterday, his wallet. There was a pause, long enough for her to hear her own heartbeat. Then, please wait. Moments later, the gate creaked open, slow and reluctant, as though deciding whether to let her in. The path wound through a courtyard filled with wilting roses and statues that had seen better days. When she reached the grand doors, a man was already waiting, tall, dressed in a black suit, his expression fixed somewhere between duty and disdain. I'm Mr. Vance, he said, his tone as cold as the marble floor behind him. Mr. Langford isn't taking visitors. Marissa offered a polite smile. I understand. I just wanted to return his wallet. He left it at the diner yesterday. He eyed the wallet, but didn't move to take it. You could have mailed it. I thought it might be important, she replied softly. It looked personal. Something flickered in his eyes, annoyance, or perhaps suspicion. Wait here. He disappeared inside, the heavy doors closing behind him. Marissa stood on the porch, the wind tugging at her hair, the faint scent of burning wood drifting from somewhere deep in the estate. She glanced around. The place was beautiful but not alive. It was a museum of sorrow, quiet, guarded, and filled with a kind of silence that had stories buried in it. After a few minutes, the door opened again. Mr. Vance reappeared, his tone unchanged. Mr. Langford appreciates your honesty, but he isn't well enough to meet anyone. Marissa nodded, though something about his words didn't sit right. She extended the wallet toward him. Please make sure he gets this. He took it, slipping it into the pocket of his coat. As he did, Marissa noticed something. The envelope inside the wallet, once sealed with deep red wax, now bore a faint crack where the seal had been broken. Her breath caught. Was that already open? Mr. Vance's eyes met hers, sharp, calm, unreadable. You must be mistaken. She frowned. No, I remember it. The seal wasn't broken before. He gave a tight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. You've done your good deed, Mississippi. That's enough for today. The dismissal was polite, but final. Marissa hesitated, a flicker of unease creeping through her chest. Something was wrong here. She could feel it in her gut. Still, she forced a nod and turned back toward the gate, her shoes clicking softly against the stones. As she walked away, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. Mr. Vance still stood by the door, watching her leave, his expression blank but his posture alert, like a guard protecting something no one was supposed to see. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint sound of metal against metal, like the closing of a lock. And somewhere behind those walls a truth stirred, restless and waiting. Marissa didn't know it yet, but the moment that seal broke, whether by accident or design, her life had just crossed into something far bigger than honesty or coincidence or kindness. It had crossed into danger. The clock in the Langford study struck midnight, its echo fading through the vast halls like a memory refusing to die. Edward sat in his armchair, a half-empty glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, throwing tired shadows across shelves lined with awards and family portraits. Ghosts of a life that had once meant something. The butler, Mr. Vance, had left hours ago, and the house had returned to its usual stillness. But tonight, something in that silence felt different, unsettled, alive. Edward reached for the wallet on his desk. The leather felt heavier than it should have, almost as if it carried more than coins and cards. He frowned, noticing the faint line where the seal on the enclosed letter had cracked. His thumb brushed over it once, twice, before he carefully unfolded the yellow paper. Inside, the handwriting was neat, deliberate, and painfully familiar. Edward, your daughter is alive. Her name is Marissa Cole. For a moment, the room disappeared. The breath left his chest as though the words had stolen it. He read it again, slowly this time, his hands trembling so hard the paper rustled like leaves in a storm. Alive, that word, simple, merciless, tore through 20 years of carefully built denial. Images crashed into him. The fire, the smoke, the screams echoing through the Langford Foundation orphanage. Running into the flames, shouting her name. The smell of burning wood. The way the world collapsed when they told him they'd found only ashes. And then, the baby's bracelet. The one engraved with ML. He'd kept it all these years, tucked inside his desk drawer, a secret reminder of what had been stolen from him. His vision blurred as tears welled in his eyes. He gripped the letter tighter, as though holding it could pull her back through time. But another image rose, darker this time. His brother Harold. The last argument they'd ever had. The lies. The betrayal. The smirk on Harold's face when he said, "Some losses are necessary, Edward. Not every child deserves your name." Edward slammed his fist against the desk. The whiskey glass shattered, spilling amber liquid across the wood, mixing with the ink from the letter. His voice broke in the empty room. "No, it can't be." He stumbled to the window, pulling aside the heavy drapes. Outside, the estate stretched into the distance, the night pressing in like an accusation. He looked toward the gate, the same gate that young woman had walked through earlier. The waitress, Marissa. Her name echoed in his mind, colliding with the letters, words, until they became one. Your daughter is alive. Her name is Marissa Cole. He sank into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Could it be possible? Could fate have brought her to his doorstep after all these years? But then doubt whispered, or is this another trick? Another cruel game? He lifted his head, his eyes glassy, but sharp with desperation. Who sent this? He muttered. Who knew? The firelight flickered, throwing orange streaks across his face, catching the edge of the photograph on his desk. A younger Edward holding a newborn wrapped in white, a woman smiling beside him. The frame trembled in his grasp as his thumb traced their faces. His wife's voice seemed to echo in the back of his mind. Promise me you'll protect her. He had failed. And now, somehow, the past had found him again. He reached for the phone, hesitated, then dialed a number he hadn't used in years. A private investigator. His voice was hoarse, quiet but certain. I need you to find someone. A woman named Marissa Cole. Start in the city. She works at Clark's Diner. As he hung up, he stared at the letter one more time. The ink had smudged slightly where his tears had fallen, but the message was still clear, still merciless. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else. After all these years, why now? The fire flared suddenly, a gust of heat rising as though the house itself had heard him. He turned away, clutching the letter to his chest. He thought he'd buried that past forever, but the truth had just walked through his gates. Edward Langford hadn't slept in 2 days. The letter lay open on his desk, its edges curling from the heat of the lamp that had burned nonstop since he'd read it. His eyes, once calm and calculating, were now rimmed with exhaustion and something darker. He had set his world in motion again. The private investigator had returned with files, photographs, and documents about Marissa Cole, a waitress, no criminal record, lived with her grandmother, Evelyn Cole, on the east side of town. Modest income, medical bills piling up. By all accounts, ordinary. But Edward's mind didn't see ordinary. It saw patterns, gaps, questions that shouldn't exist. He spread the papers across his desk, sorting them into piles: birth records, employment slips, hospital forms. His hand froze on one document: Marissa's birth certificate. No father listed. Mother unknown. He stared at that blank space, feeling his pulse quicken. His name should have been there. His daughter's name should have never disappeared from the world like that. He pushed back in his chair, his chest tightening. Something wasn't right. Evelyn Cole, the grandmother, had taken custody of Marissa after an accident. But there were no legal adoption papers, no hospital record linking Marissa to her. He picked up the phone again. Find out who handled the fire investigation at the Langford Foundation 20 years ago, he ordered. And dig into Harold Langford's estate records while you're at it. When he hung up, he stared into the fireplace, the same flames that once took everything from him. His thoughts began to blur with the past. He saw Harold again, younger, sharper, always one step ahead in business and one shade colder in heart. They'd argued over the foundation, over the money, over the orphanage expansion. But that night before the fire, Harold had said something Edward could never forget. "You're blinded by emotion, brother. Your compassion will destroy this family." Then came the flames, the confusion, the report that claimed Harold had tried to save people, a hero in the public eye. But Edward knew better. He'd always known Harold had secrets, and now, with that letter in hand, he was certain this was one of them. He leaned forward, gripping his temples. Could Harold have lied about the fire? Could he have hidden Edward's daughter, handed her off to someone else under a false name? The questions spun faster than he could think. A part of him whispered hope. "She's alive, Edward. You found her." But another voice, colder, sharper, hissed out, "What if this girl is a con? What if someone planted her to break you? To take what's left of your empire?" He stood abruptly, knocking the glass of whiskey to the floor. "No," he muttered under his breath. "I won't be fooled again." His reflection caught his eye in the window. The man staring back didn't look like the billionaire who once graced magazine covers. He looked older, hollowed out, like the truth had carved lines deeper than time ever could. He opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out the baby's bracelet, ML. The tiny engraving glimmered under the lamp. He held it next to the photo of Marissa the investigator had taken outside the diner. Same eyes, same gentle smile. The resemblance was uncanny. Yet, uncertainty still gnawed at him. He whispered to himself, "If she's my daughter, why hasn't she said anything? Why hasn't she come forward?" The night stretched on as he pored over more documents, tracing timelines, comparing dates, desperate for proof. He circled names, underlined addresses, scribbled theories across a notepad filled with obsession. And then he found it. A hospital record from the same week as the fire. A newborn listed as baby girl, no ID. Discharged 2 days later into temporary care under a woman named Evelyn Cole. His breath caught. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. But before relief could settle, fear took its place. If this was true, if Marissa really was his daughter, then someone had lied to him for decades. Someone had stolen her, buried the truth, and built a life on deceit. He clenched his fists, whispering Harold's name like a curse. Now, it wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about uncovering a betrayal that had burned deeper than any fire. And as dawn crept through the window, Edward made a promise to himself, one that chilled even him. He would find out everything about Marissa Cole, even if it destroyed him in the process. The morning started like any other at Maplewood Diner. The scent of burnt toast, the hum of an old jukebox, and the chatter of regulars who came for comfort more than coffee. But for Marissa, peace lasted only until the mail arrived. Among the bills and flyers was an envelope with no return address. Her name was written across it in shaky handwriting, almost as if the sender's hand trembled with hesitation. She turned it over, noticing how the seal had already been broken once and re-glued. A strange chill ran down her spine. When she slid the paper out, a single clipping fell onto the counter. It was yellowed with age, a newspaper article with a black and white photo of a house engulfed in flames. The headline read, "The Langford Estate Fire Claims Lives. One child unaccounted for." Her breath caught. She read the words again and again, feeling her heart race faster with each line. Edward Langford, a wealthy philanthropist, a tragic fire, a missing baby girl. At first, it felt distant, another sad story from a world far removed from hers. But something about the photo tugged at her. The house, the gate. She had seen that design before, not in real life, but in a picture that hung for years in her grandmother's living room. Marissa's hands trembled as she grabbed her phone and called out, "Grandma, can you come here for a sec?" Evelyn shuffled in slowly, wiping her hands on a dish towel. When her eyes fell on the clipping, she froze. The color drained from her face. The towel slipped to the floor. "Where did you get that?" Evelyn's voice was thin, trembling. "It came in the mail," Marissa said softly. "Why do you look like that? Do you know them?" Evelyn stared at the photo for a long moment, her lips pressed together, eyes glistening. Then she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "Oh, dear Lord," she whispered. "It's all come back." Marissa knelt beside her. Grandma, you're scaring me. What's going on? Evelyn lifted her head, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. I never wanted this day to come, she murmured. You were just a baby, barely old enough to walk. There was smoke everywhere, screams. I heard them calling for help. Marissa's eyes widened. What are you talking about? The night of the fire, Evelyn said, her voice cracking. I was a nurse back then. I lived near the Langford estate. When I ran toward the flames, I found a little girl in the garden, covered in soot, crying, clutching a bracelet. Evelyn reached for Marissa's hand, gripping it tightly. That little girl was you, Marissa. The words landed like a blow. Marissa's mind went blank. She pulled her hand away, shaking her head. No, that can't be true. My parents. Evelyn interrupted, voice breaking. I lied to protect you. There was chaos after the fire. Rumors, threats, money changing hands. Someone wanted the child gone. I didn't know who to trust, so I took you. I gave you my name. I raised you as my own because I couldn't let them find you. Marissa stood, her chest tightening as if the room were shrinking. You mean my whole life everything was a lie? Evelyn's shoulders slumped. A lie that saved you. Marissa turned away, her mind spinning. Every memory suddenly felt like borrowed time. Every bedtime story, every photo, every I love you now tangled with the unbearable truth. How could you not tell me? She whispered. Evelyn looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. Because I was afraid. Afraid that once you knew, you'd go looking for the truth, and that truth might destroy you. Silence filled the kitchen, heavy, suffocating. Marissa's tears finally broke free. Gratitude wrestled with betrayal. Love collided with anger. She wanted to scream, to hug her grandmother, to run, all at once. After a long pause, Evelyn reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out something small, a faded pink bracelet, its silver charm engraved with 2 letters. ML. Marissa stared at it, realizing it matched the initials from a news clipping. Her hands shook as she touched it. Marissa Langford, Evelyn whispered through tears. That was your name before I gave you mine. Marissa's voice quivered. So I'm his daughter? Evelyn nodded slowly. Yes, Edward Langford's little girl, the one the world thought had died. The room seemed to spin. Marissa clutched the counter to steady herself. Everything she thought she knew, her home, her name, her story, had just collapsed. The clock ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, she looked up, her voice barely a whisper. All this time and you never told me. Evelyn wiped her tears. Sometimes love means keeping the hardest secrets. Marissa's heart broke at the words. She turned away, her reflection in the kitchen window, a stranger's face. The day felt strangely still at Maplewood Diner. The usual hum of conversation was muted, as if the air itself waited for something to happen. Marissa wiped the counter absently, her mind miles away. Evelyn's confession had left her hollow, suspended between 2 worlds, the life she'd known and the one that now whispered her name through the smoke of the past. Then the bell above the door chimed. A tall man stepped in. His presence shifted the room's energy at once. Even the chatter of the regulars faltered. He was well-dressed, the kind of refined that didn't belong in a place that smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee. His eyes searched the room until they landed on her. Miss Cole, he said quietly. His voice carried authority, but also something fragile beneath it. Marissa froze. She knew that face not personally, but from newspaper articles, charity events, and headlines that once seemed distant. Edward Langford. Yes, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Can I help you? He took a seat at the counter, resting his hands gently in front of him. I believe you already have, he said. A few days ago. A wallet. Marissa nodded, heart pounding. Oh, yes. I returned it through your butler. I wasn't sure if... You did the right thing, he interrupted softly. Most people wouldn't have. The air between them thickened with unspoken tension. His gaze lingered on her, studying every movement, every flicker of her expression, as if trying to confirm something he couldn't yet say aloud. You remind me of someone, Edward said after a pause. Someone I once knew. Marissa forced a polite smile. I get that sometimes. But he didn't smile back. His voice lowered. Do you sing? She blinked confused. Sing? Not really. Why? There was a song, he murmured, his eyes distant. A lullaby my wife used to sing to our daughter. Golden skies, gentle dreams, angels keep you while you sleep. His voice cracked slightly as he recited it. Does that sound familiar to you? Marissa frowned, the words striking something deep inside her. I don't know, she stammered. Maybe. I think I've heard it before, but I can't place it. Edward's hands trembled slightly. Perhaps your grandmother sang it? She hesitated. Evelyn used to hum something like that when I was little. I never knew the words. His throat tightened. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. A young woman holding a baby, both smiling under the sun. Do you recognize her? Marissa's eyes widened. Her breath caught. That's her, she whispered before she could stop herself. That's the woman for my dreams. Edward's voice was barely audible. That's my wife, Lillian. Silence swallowed the room. He looked down, struggling to steady his voice. You see, Miss Cole, years ago my family went through something terrible. A fire. My daughter, she was never found. Marissa gripped the counter, her mind spinning. She wanted to speak, but couldn't. Every instinct screamed that this was connected to the truth Evelyn had hidden, that somehow this man sitting before her wasn't a stranger after all. Edward's eyes filled with quiet desperation. Tell me something, Marissa. When you were a child, did you ever have a bracelet? Silver with initials on it? Her hands trembled. Yes, she whispered. I still have it. It's got the letters ML. For a moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to narrow around them, leaving only the sound of two hearts beating too fast. Edward took a slow breath, as if trying to steady the tremor in his voice. Come to Ashbury Hill, he said gently. There's something you deserve to know. She stared at him, torn between fear and curiosity. Why me? Because, he said, standing. I think the answers you've been looking for are waiting there. As he walked out of the diner, leaving her alone with a swirl of emotions she couldn't name, Marissa felt the weight of the moment pressed down on her. For years, she had dreamed of finding where she came from. But now that the door had opened, she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through it. And as she looked out the diner window, watching Edward's car disappear into the distance, one haunting thought echoed in her mind. For the first time, Marissa wondered if she wanted the truth, or if some doors were better left closed. The Langford mansion gleamed beneath the fading dusk, a castle of glass and stone that seemed to hold its breath. Inside, chandeliers shimmered like frozen rain, their light falling over a dinner table too long, too polished, and far too quiet. Marissa sat near the end, her posture straight, her eyes darting between Edward and the man who had greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, Harold Langford. The air smelled of aged wine and secrets. Silver clinked softly against porcelain, the kind of delicate sound that usually belonged to comfort. But here, it was tension disguised as civility. Edward watched her with the kind of gaze that carried both tenderness and suspicion. Harold, on the other hand, kept filling her glass, offering her more food, more warmth, as if he could drown her instincts in hospitality. So Marissa, Harold began, voice smooth, Edward tells me you found his wallet. Quite the good Samaritan, aren't you? Marissa smiled politely. Anyone would have done the same. Not anyone, Edward said quietly, cutting his steak. His tone wasn't just gratitude. It was layered with something deeper. He looked at her as if every word she spoke held the weight of a decade-old truth. Harold leaned back, watching the exchange. You remind me of someone, he murmured. Can't quite place who. Marissa's stomach tightened. She caught Edward's subtle glance toward Harold, sharp, almost warning. The silence that followed was thick, like smoke from a memory no one wanted to name. Edward finally broke it. You said you grew up here in Ashbury? She nodded. All my life. And your parents? My mom passed when I was little. My grandmother raised me. Something flickered across Edward's face. Recognition, pain, and then restraint. Harold noticed it too, and quickly interjected. Evelyn Cole, right? Fine woman. Hardworking. Shame about her husband's disappearance. Marissa froze. How do you know about that? Harold smiled, tilting his glass. Old town. Old stories. Some things never really burn away. The word burn hit, like an echo of the fire she had just read about days ago. She tried to hide her reaction, but Edward saw it. His fork stilled midair. The sound of the grandfather clock ticked louder. One tick per secret unspoken. A sudden gust blew through the open balcony doors, and one of the candles flickered out. For a moment, the room dipped into shadow, the air heavy with unsaid truths. Marissa glanced at Harold, his jaw tight, his hand gripping the table's edge. Edward noticed that too. "You were there that night," Edward said softly, eyes never leaving his brother's face. Harold's laugh came too fast. "Edward, please. You've been through enough. Don't drag the past into dinner." But Edward leaned forward, his voice trembling with quiet rage. "You said you tried to save her. You told me there were no survivors." Marissa's pulse quickened. "Save who?" Neither man answered. The storm outside began to rumble, wind sweeping through the curtains like a warning. Harold stood, smoothing his jacket. "Excuse me," he said tightly, before disappearing down the hallway. Edward remained still, eyes fixed on the untouched glass of wine Harold had left behind. He whispered, almost to himself, "Guilt has a way of dressing itself in manners." Marissa's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Langford, what really happened that night?" Edward looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time, she saw not the billionaire, not the philanthropist, but a man crushed under the ruins of a fire that never stopped burning. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a charred photograph. 2 men, a woman, and a baby in her arms. He placed it on the table between them. "The truth," he said quietly, "is sitting right in front of me." Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the fear, the guilt, and the dawning horror on Marissa's face. And as thunder rolled over Ashbury Hill, she finally understood. Dinner at the mansion wasn't about gratitude. It was about ghosts demanding to be heard. The study was a museum of memory. Old books lined the walls, portraits stared down from the shadows, and the faint scent of smoke and cedar lingered in the air. Marissa moved quietly, fingers tracing the edges of picture frames, the smooth curve of the grand desk. Outside, thunder rolled over Ashbury Hill, its echo crawling through the mansion like a heartbeat too loud to ignore. Her eyes caught something glinting on a lower shelf, a small wooden box, half hidden behind a row of ledgers. She hesitated before opening it. Inside, resting on a piece of scorched lace, was a delicate bracelet. The silver was tarnished, the clasp slightly bent, but the engraving was still visible. M.L. Marissa's breath caught. She brushed her thumb over the letters, as if they might change. The initials seemed to burn against her skin, familiar, intimate, impossible. Then she heard it, the soft creak of the study door opening. Edward stood there, frozen mid-step, eyes fixed on the bracelet in her hand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside filled the silence, rain whispering against the tall windows. "Where did you find that?" His voice was hoarse, almost broken. "In here," she said, her tone trembling. "What do these letters mean?" Edward stepped forward, his gaze locked on the tiny piece of silver like it carried every ghost he'd ever tried to bury. "That bracelet belonged to my daughter," he said softly. "Marissa Langford." She shook her head, the name hitting her like a blade. No, that's not possible." He moved closer, desperation in his eyes. "You were a baby. There was a fire. We searched for days. I buried what they told me were your remains." Marissa backed away, tears forming, the room spinning. "Stop. Don't say that." "Look at it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Look at it. That was on your wrist the night she was taken." Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The truth was pressing down from all sides. The anonymous letter, Evelyn's confession, the way Edward had looked at her from the start. It all collided at once, and her denial shattered into silence. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the room, sharp, cold, and full of something darker. "Enough." Harold stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat. His face, once perfectly composed, now twitched with exhaustion and fury. "Edward, you always did know how to dramatize," he sneered. "You want the truth? Fine. You're looking at the reason your family burned." Edward turned slowly, his expression hollow. "What are you saying?" Harold's laugh was brittle. "I started the fire, not to kill anyone, at least not you. But your wife, she wanted to hand everything over to charity. The foundation, the estate, everything. You were too blind to see she'd ruin us." Marissa gasped, stepping back. You killed him? Harold's voice rose. I didn't mean to. It was supposed to scare her, make her listen. But flames don't listen, do they? Edward lunged forward, grief turning to rage. You let me mourn my daughter for 20 years. I saved you, Harold shouted. You built an empire out of that tragedy. You were nothing before it. The brothers' words collided like thunder, overlapping, drowning in the sound of rain battering the glass. Marissa stood between them, trembling, the bracelet clenched in her hand. Stop, she whispered, but neither did. Then Edward's voice fell to a whisper. You took everything from me, and now you're proud of it? Harold's mask slipped completely, his face twisted, and for the first time he looked small, a man cornered by the ruin he'd built. You think you're the victim? He said, voice cracking. You were never meant to find her. The room went silent. Only the storm spoke now, a low hum of reckoning. Marissa looked at Edward, the man she'd unknowingly served coffee to, the man whose grief had shaped her life, and whispered through her tears. Then who am I? If everything I knew was a lie? Edward's eyes glistened. You're my daughter, he said. And in that moment, as thunder split the sky above Ashbury Hill, everything she thought she was and everything she thought she hated collided into one unbearable truth. Edward sat alone in the great hall of the mansion, the glow from the fireplace casting long, tired shadows across the marble floor. His hands trembled as he stared at the DNA report spread out before him. Clean, official, undeniable. Not match. 2 words that gutted him more than any wound ever could. Across from him, Harold leaned casually against a mantel, his tone laced with false sympathy. I told you, brother. She's clever, I'll give her that. Knew just enough about the fire to make you want to believe. But that girl isn't family. She saw an opportunity and took it. Edward's eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight. She had the bracelet, Harold. The bracelet. Harold sighed, shaking his head. Stolen. Or planted. You think con artists don't do their homework? You've been grieving for decades. You were bound to see ghosts in any kind face. Edward's silence stretched. His mind reeled between disbelief and hope, between the warmth in Marissa's eyes and the cold print on the page in front of him. The paper didn't lie. Science didn't lie. But Harold always did. Still, doubt crept in, heavy and cruel. Then why? Edward whispered. Why did she come here at all? Money, Harold said simply. She's been waiting for someone to open that old wound. And you practically invited her in. You've always needed saving, Edward. Always chasing something to fill the emptiness. Edward rose, anger flickering, but it was weak, like a candle in the wind. He was too tired to fight, too broken to see clearly. She looked like her, he murmured, voice cracking. The eyes, the way she smiled. Harold stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. That's what makes liars dangerous. They were the faces we miss the most. And just like that, the last thread of conviction snapped. By morning, Marissa was gone. She left quietly, before the staff woke, her bag slung over one shoulder and her heart heavier than ever. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of storm. She paused at the gate, staring up at the mansion that had promised answers and given her nothing but pain. Inside, Edward watched her from the window, his reflection a ghost over the glass. The report lay open beside him, its black ink screaming louder than any truth his heart wanted to believe. He wanted to call out, to stop her, to tell her that maybe the test was wrong. But the voice of doubt, Harold's voice, had already settled in his head like poison. By the time Marissa reached the bus stop, she could no longer hold back the tears. Every word, every look, every fragile hope she had built crumbled into silence. She thought of Evelyn, of her trembling confession, of the life she'd built from lies she never asked for. She thought of Edward, not the billionaire, but the man who looked at her like a lost piece of himself. And still she left, because sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it leaves you standing alone, watching everything you thought you would drift away. Back at the mansion, Edward sat slumped in his chair, Harold beside him, pretending concern. You did the right thing, Harold said quietly. You protected yourself and the family name. Edward didn't answer. His eyes lingered on the flames, watching them twist and dance like they carried memories only he could see. Then, faintly as the fire crackled, a whisper of doubt returned. A memory of a nurse's lullaby, the exact one Marissa had hummed without knowing. His fingers clenched, the report on the table blurred behind the tears welling in his eyes. Something was wrong. He could feel it, like truth pressing against the walls of a lie. Because lies built on greed always collapse, and the truth, no matter how buried, has its own way of returning home. Would you walk away, or fight to prove who you are? The day Evelyn passed, the world seemed to slow down. The tiny apartment that had always smelled of lavender and soup suddenly felt hollow, like the air itself had forgotten how to breathe. Marissa sat at her bedside, holding her grandmother's frail hand until the last flicker of warmth faded from her skin. For hours she didn't move. Grief came not as a wave, but as a quiet, suffocating fog. Evelyn had been her only family, her only constant, and now she was gone. The woman who had raised her, protected her, lied for her, gone without giving her the answers she needed most. When the funeral was over, Marissa packed Evelyn's things with trembling hands. Folded scarves, photographs, recipes written in faded ink. Each one felt like a goodbye. Then, at the very bottom of an old wooden chest, beneath a bundle of yellowed letters tied with blue ribbon, she found something different. An envelope, sealed, her name written on the front in delicate handwriting that wasn't Evelyn's. Marissa. Her heartbeat stumbled. She tore it open with shaking fingers. Inside were two papers, one handwritten letter and another folded document, official and creased with age. The letter began softly. If you are reading this, it means Evelyn has kept her promise. I am sorry for the years you lost, for the life taken from you. My name is Amelia Langford and I am your mother. The words blurred as tears filled Marissa's eyes. She pressed the paper to her chest, gasping for air. Amelia wrote of the fire, how she had uncovered Harold's embezzlement from Langford Foundation, how she had confronted him, and how that same night the fire had started. She wrote of the chaos, the smoke, the cries for help, and how someone had told her that her baby hadn't survived. But the truth was buried in the document that followed. The DNA report, the real one, the one Harold had switched all those years ago, the one that proved Edward and Amelia Langford were her parents. Every line, every signature, every official stamp screamed the truth Harold had stolen. Evelyn hadn't lied to protect herself. She'd lied to protect Marissa from a man who burned everything he couldn't control. Marissa's tears turned from sorrow to fury. Her hands shook as she clutched the letter, a fragile piece of hope in a world built on deceit. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. Some things are better left where they fell. But how could she leave this? How could she stay silent knowing that the man who destroyed her family still walked free? That Edward, her father, lived under the weight of Harold's lies. She stood there for a long time, the afternoon light spilling through the curtains like a quiet promise. Evelyn was gone. The truth was all that remained. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to set it right. Marissa folded the letter carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and looked toward the window, toward the mansion on the hill she once swore never to return to. Her grief hadn't vanished, but something else had awakened in its place. Resolve. Because sometimes the fight for truth doesn't begin in strength. It begins in loss, when there's nothing left to lose. Edward Langford had spent a lifetime building walls around his empire, his secrets, and most of all, his heart. But that morning, when he found the second letter tucked inside an old ledger in his study, those walls began to crack. It was Amelia's handwriting. Her voice came alive through the ink, trembling with urgency and love. She wrote of Harold's deception, of the fire, of the DNA test he'd forged to erase their daughter's existence. Every sentence cut deeper than the last. And when Edward reached the final line, "If you ever find her, hold her close. She is our light," his world came undone. The fury that rose inside him was not the cold kind he used to win boardroom wars. This was raw, ancient human, the kind that burned behind trembling hands and a breaking voice. He called for Harold. Within minutes his brother entered, smug as ever, unaware that his years of deceit were about to collapse. "Edward, what is it now?" Harold asked, sipping from a glass of scotch like he owned the room. Edward's voice trembled with rage. You told me my daughter died. You forged her DNA test. You burned down my house. You stole everything. Harold froze, a flicker of fear behind his practiced grin. You're talking nonsense. Edward slammed the letter onto the desk. Read it. The silence stretched long and sharp. Harold's mask cracked. His eyes darted, searching for escape, but there was none left. I did what I had to, he snapped finally. You were weak, Edward. You let Amelia control everything. The foundation, the money, the legacy. You would have ruined us. You ruined me, Edward said quietly. You ruined her. His voice broke on that last word. Moments later, the study door opened again. Security, called by Edward moments before Harold's arrival. The officers stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming under the chandelier. Harold's face twisted between rage and disbelief as they pulled him away. This isn't over, he shouted. You think they'll believe her? A waitress. Edward's voice was steady now. They already do. Because by then, the truth had already begun to spread. Within days, Edward went public. He called a press conference on the steps of the Langford Foundation. Rebuilt, restored, but this time, no longer hiding the scars of its past. The cameras rolled as he spoke, his voice heavy but clear. My name is Edward Langford, he began, and I have spent years living in the shadow of lies. Today those lies end. The woman known as Marissa Cole is my daughter. The fire that took my wife and nearly took her was not an accident. Justice will finally be served. Somewhere in the crowd, Marissa stood, tears streaming silently. Not because of his words alone, but because for the first time, she saw in his eyes what she'd been missing her whole life, recognition. After the conference, Edward approached her. There were no grand speeches, no rehearsed apologies. Only two people, both broken in their own ways, standing in the middle of the truth. I'm sorry, he said softly, for not finding you sooner. Marissa shook her head. You didn't lose me. You just didn't know where to look. They stood there in silence. Years of grief dissolving into something fragile, something almost like peace. That night, for the first time in decades, Edward Langford felt lighter. He had lost everything once, his wife, his daughter, his faith in good. But in facing the truth, he had found what no wealth could ever buy: redemption. The morning sun stretched across the Langford estate like a quiet promise of peace. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter, not heavy with secrets or sorrow, but filled with something new: belonging. Marissa stood at the gates of Ashbury Hill, her heart racing as they opened slowly before her. She had walked these grounds once as a stranger, returning a wallet she thought belonged to a man she'd never know. Today, she walked as his daughter. Edward Langford waited at the entrance, no longer the weary, guarded billionaire she once served coffee to. The sharpness in his face had softened, replaced by something warmer: gratitude, humility, love. Welcome home, Marissa, he said, voice thick with emotion. The words broke her completely. She stepped forward, and for the first time, they embraced, not as two people bound by fate, but as a father and daughter reunited by truth. In the weeks that followed, Edward did more than rebuild his family. He rebuilt lives. The Maplewood Diner, once worn and fading, was restored to its full glow. Its sign now read Evelyn's Place, in honor of the woman who had saved and raised his daughter. And beyond that, Edward established the Amelia Langford Nursing Scholarship Fund, granting young dreamers, those like Marissa once was, the chance to pursue education without fear of poverty holding them back. When the media asked why, he simply said, because one act of honesty can change everything. The day the diner reopened, Marissa stood by the counter again, not as a struggling waitress, but as a woman who had found her purpose, her family, and her truth. Edward sat at his usual corner booth, smiling as she poured him a cup of coffee. It was the same simple ritual that had once connected them, but now it carried an entire lifetime of meaning. As the light faded and the diner filled with laughter, Edward looked at her and said quietly, it turns out the wallet wasn't lost. It was sent by fate to bring a family home again. Marissa smiled, her eyes shining. She had spent her whole life searching for where she belonged. And now she finally knew it wasn't just in blood or fortune, but in love, truth, and the courage to do what's right. If you believe that honesty can change a life, share this story. And remember, sometimes, returning what's lost gives back more than we could ever imagine.